Hi, this is Don Forsyth speaking again of groups and group dynamics. The topic of today's presentation is leadership. And as usual, we'll do it in several parts. I just want to initially speak of some of the myths and misunderstandings regarding leadership, and then we'll turn to theories of leadership emergence, and finally to questions about what makes for effective leadership. Leadership is no small topic. Many have written extensively on questions of leadership, how to be a successful leader, and how, in particular, to not be a successful leadership. In fact, the great Pulitzer Prize winning author and historian James McGregor Burns often is quoted as stating one of the most observed and least understood phenomenon on earth is leadership. But much of the mystery of leadership, I believe, evaporates when we examine this phenomenon from the group perspective, taking a group level approach. And yet that approach, it's not consistent with most people's intuitions about leaders and leadership. Generally, most people think of leaders as specific individuals who, perhaps working alone, are able to sway others, to change other peoples. In fact, for example, if you Google the word leadership, you certainly get many hits on the internet, but most of these are images of single individuals. But in our analysis of groups, what we find across all these kinds of situations is leaders working in relatively small groups to achieve change. So the conclusion from the group perspective is leadership can take place across great expanses, but more frequently occurs in a context, and that context is the small group. To give one final example, even extremely powerful leaders work through and within their groups. For example, the President of the United States, currently Barack Obama, sometimes gives speeches to the entire nation, but more frequently, his day-to-day work occurs in groups. In fact, analyses of all the U.S. presidents find that their behavior was substantially influenced by those they worked with. Sometimes family, sometimes friends, but of course their cabinets as well. And each president tended to organize their administration a little bit differently. But if you were to try to understand even presidential leadership, what some people might suggest as being large L leadership, you'd have to take into account small L leadership, which is leadership which takes place in groups. So, as we discuss some myths regarding leadership, certainly the first one would be that leadership is a quality of a person, and that to best understand leadership, you must understand individuals. My contrary perspective would be that no, to understand leadership, you need to understand groups and their dynamics. Two other questions I want to consider in this unit would be what is leadership and what do leaders do? But first, let's dispel a few more myths. Basically, the idea is that leaders have certain unique qualities or competencies that differentiate them from their followers, and certainly there is a considerable skill level involved in leadership, and that leaders often are more experienced in group contexts. But from our perspective, it's working with others, skill in understanding groups, and the capacity to work well with others in groups, which is the critical competency leaders require. Leadership is also sometimes viewed as a coercive, power-like quality, and certainly when we examined power in other chapters examining group dynamics, we were reminded of that. However, in most cases, leaders have power with other people. They work collaboratively with others in groups. Certainly the command and control style of leadership, which is often present in military contexts or political contexts, is common and typical. But in the small group kinds of processes, we're examining leadership is with people rather than over people. There are some qualities of leaders which are perhaps unlearned, and in a society perhaps which values certain naturally existing characteristics. In many Western societies, for example, small groups still continue to this day favor males as leaders over females as leaders. But this is more a case of a bias within the group members who have accepted cultural stereotypes about the sexes. And so this inborn quality, this natural characteristic of one's sex, influences who emerges as leader and who is most influential. But when we think about what makes for skilled leadership, most of these are characteristics which can be learned over time. And there are some groups that certainly do not have any leaders within them at all. The leader-follower role is, in many cases, the first to emerge within a group as status differentiation occurs. But in many cases, the responsibilities of a leader are distributed throughout the group so that there's no one single individual responsible for carrying out the key duties of leadership. Sometimes suggest that it would be best to dispel with leaders altogether. But overall, the research suggests that group members tend to respond positively to effective leadership and prefer to work in groups which are hierarchically structured, where the responsibilities of leadership are clearly defined and assigned. But we should not put too much emphasis on the leader as making or breaking or being the most critical role to take into account to explain when a group will be an effective one. Certainly, leaders can be influential. A very ineffective leader can contaminate a group and cause it to make poor decisions and perform ineffectively. But on the other hand, a leader doesn't explain all of group behavior. They do not make all the difference. Meadle's concept of the romance of the leadership suggests that too often, intuitively, people assume that there's something wonderful about the leadership role, and that a good leader is all it takes to turn a mediocre group into a highly successful one. But that's romanticizing to a degree the extent to which leaders actually influence their group. Taking all those myths into account and dispelling them as well, so what is leadership? There are, of course, many definitions to it, but one we can work with as a working definition is guidance of others in their pursuits, often by directing, organizing, coordinating, supporting, and motivating their efforts. The typical characteristics of leadership are that it's a reciprocal process. One cannot have a leader without followers. Leadership implies a degree of something, a process which has sometimes been described as followership, although the word followership hasn't really caught on as strongly as the word leadership has. Oftentimes this relationship is a transactional one. It's an exchange-based process where the leader provides certain services to the group, expects that group members will respond as well in meeting the leader's needs, but both leader and follower prosper from this transaction. Leadership is often described as well as being transformational, as James McGregor Burns suggested in his 1978 book Leadership, is that we expect groups to, in many cases, transform their group members in some way, in a positive way, we hope, perhaps by motivating them, by making them, increasing their level of satisfaction and happiness, possibly even transforming their values, shifting them from a more individualistic perspective to a more collective one. Because leadership is a cooperative process for the most part. Again, there are some extremely powerful leaders who exploit their group members, but in general, when we speak of leadership, we think of this as a cooperative relationship, one which facilitates the attainment of not just the leader's goals, but the group members' goals as well. So it's reciprocal, transactional, transformational, cooperative, and adaptive, and goal-seeking. But what do leaders do exactly, given this burden, these responsibilities? Some of the earliest work examining leadership took a very descriptive approach, stepping back and tried to watch group leaders as they went about their work. Tried to watch, for example, business executives on a day-to-day basis, watched military leaders as they carried out their work. What exactly goes into the leadership role? And as a result of those studies, time and again, it was noted that the two fundamental tasks of the leader, the two basic constellations of behaviors that comprise leadership are task leadership and relationship leadership. So the task leadership involves promoting task completion, regulating behaviors, monitoring communication, reducing the ambiguity of the goals the group seeks, and relationship leadership holds the group together, maintains positive relations. So the leaders must help the group achieve their goals. They're adaptive in the task-related sense, but they also must keep the group together. And this can be summarized as the task relationship model, if you will. Perhaps first identified most clearly by the Ohio State researchers who developed the Leadership Behavior Description Questionnaire, LBDQ. Over the years, there have been hundreds of studies done examining the relationship between these two components of leadership and overall leadership success. And this is summarized in Tim Judge's and his colleagues' meta-analytic study they did relatively recently, which shows that when you examine certain outcomes, particularly member satisfactions with their leaders, you do find that relationship leader is highly correlated with those outcomes, as we can see in this chart. And here we go. Follower satisfaction with the leadership is very highly correlated, nearly 0.7, with relationship leadership. Leadership effectiveness overall, slightly more relationship than task-oriented. Task-related leadership is correlated as well. So you can see that both forms of leadership are essential for successful leadership. Other approaches have noted, however, that the leader need not always engage in task and relationship-oriented behavior. Curran Jeremy's theory, leadership substitute theories, identifies three clusters of situational characteristics, group member characteristics, task characteristics, and characteristics of the organization, which when present substitute for either task-oriented leadership or relationship-oriented leadership. So as they say, for example, do the group members have ability, experience, training, and knowledge? Do they have a high need for independence? Are they professionals, for example? Do they not really care about what rewards a leader might offer them? And exactly what's the group working on? Is it an intrinsically satisfying task, or is it perhaps so routine leadership is unnecessary? And what's the organization like? Is it a highly structured organization, highly inflexible, so that the leader really, there's nothing really a leader can do to facilitate task performance or even to meet the relationship needs of the group members? They suggest that you should take into account all of these aspects of the context to decide whether or not a leader should engage in relationship behavior or task-related behavior. So they suggest, for example, that all of these factors, other than intrinsically satisfying, will neutralize task leadership versus some of the other factors, such as need for independence, intrinsic satisfaction, and whether or not the group is already closely knit, has already maximized the quality of its interpersonal relations, will neutralize relationship-oriented leadership. It is the case that leadership tends to be task-focused and relationship-focused, and it is also the case that we do have two kinds of leaders in the world. We have men who are leaders and women who are leaders. So the question often arises, are men more likely to be task leaders, and are women more likely to be relationship leaders? There is a tendency, documented in the literature, for this to be the case, that men do tend to focus more on the work to be done, the goals to be assigned, so they are more likely to assign tasks, to be critical of poor work, to coordinate activity related to accomplishment of the task. Women leaders are somewhat more relational than male leaders, so they are more concerned with the overall outcomes of the group members in terms of their relationships. They are more likely to be egalitarian in their approach to leadership. They're more likely to listen to members' needs and respond to their members' needs. But this is just a tendency overall, and it certainly doesn't mean that any particular leader, a man who is a leader, cannot engage in relationship behaviors or will not, and that a woman leader will not engage in task-related behaviors. So as we've seen, there are a number of leadership myths regarding leadership, but our particular perspective is that to understand leadership, you have to understand little L leadership, leadership which occurs in a group context. that leadership is a cooperative endeavor. It involves transactions and transformation of leaders and groups as they strive, followers as they strive to reach shared goals within the group. And that one way to understand leadership, at least a first take on leadership, is that it generally involves two components, which is the task-oriented component and the relationship-oriented component. And that while there are some sex differences, men do tend to be somewhat more task, women somewhat more relationship. There's many exceptions to that general tendency. We'll turn next, in the next presentation, to questions of leadership emergence. Thank you as always for joining me.